Actually, let's just start with the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Let's pause just a moment to give rise to the motivation of bodhicitta, right? So grounded in love, universal compassion, and generating out of universal compassion the wish to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings. I was actually just thinking about that yesterday. We were, Kensei Rinpoche's been teaching over a couple of years so far the Supplement to the Middle Way, Majjhima Avatara by Chandrakirti, which is considered. Actually, we're going to get into that today, so it's good to mention. Which is considered by most Tibetan masters, I guess, to be the most definitive work ever written on the topic of emptiness by any of the great Indian pandits. And Chandrakirti starts his text, which explains emptiness so clearly, by saying, first I pay homage to compassion. And then he says, and then there's a section there where he says, at the beginning of the practice, compassion is important. In the middle of the practice, compassion is important. At the end of the practice, compassion is important. Which is very beautiful. He's talking about wisdom as the main topic of the text, but he says compassion. He starts it with an homage to, usually they pay homage to a teacher, right, like Manjushri or the Buddha or something. But he begins by paying homage to compassion, because he says that's the source of all the good qualities, all the teachers, that they wouldn't teach if they didn't have compassion. But so, okay, so now we're ready to start. We've been doing, I was thinking about this, so we've been teaching or going through whatever the middle length Lam Rim of Lama Tsongkhapa for a little more than 2 years. And now we're entering into kind of the final main section. Which is the section on special insight or emptiness, or the wisdom section, the section on wisdom, or the section on special insight, so like vipassana in Sanskrit or Lakton in Tibetan, but special insight. And I'll say a couple just introductory remarks on this section. One is, Lama Tsongkhapa, who wrote this text, right? I'll just share, what I was in a few years ago, five or 6 years ago, I was in India, and his Dalai Lama was giving the transmission of this text. I only got there for part of that, but he made a point, actually. He said, just as his own experience, the Dalai Lama's own, he was talking from his own experience, and he said, when it comes to the training in compassion and bodhicitta, he said, in his opinion, there was no text ever written better than Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He just said, that's, there are many wonderful texts on that topic, but when it comes to the trainings of Bodhisattva, he felt there was nothing ever written better than Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And then, and now he was talking at a Gelugpa monastery to Gelugpa scholars, but he said, when it comes to understanding emptiness, there are many great treatises by the Indian masters, but he said for himself, that if you studied the 5 major works of Lama Tsongkhapa on emptiness, they were he didn't use this word, but almost like a key, that he said if you studied those, then if you go on to study any of the great works of the Indian masters, you'll understand them correctly. Whereas if you haven't studied that, then it's more difficult, because the Indian texts are quite difficult to understand, was his point. So he was really saying that he felt Lama Tsongkhapa had explained the difficult points that other people had misunderstood sometimes in a very clear way. And so this text is one of the 5 major treatises by Lama Tsongkhapa on emptiness. He wrote 5, he wrote many works on emptiness, but there were 5 that are considered particularly important, and this is one of them. And I couldn't remember, I can't remember now. It was either the last or the second to last that he wrote. So it was like one of his final statements on the topic of emptiness and wisdom. Oh, sorry, we're up to page 238 in the text. And actually, I'll share that too. The Dalai Lama actually suggested, he said, it was very, for those who practice sort of, or interested in the Glugpa tradition, he had an interesting point. He said, I love this. He said so many of because there were a lot of monks there from the Glugpa tradition, and he said, many of you will recite 100,000 prayers to Lama Tsongkhapa. Like they do a nundro, right? Guru Yoga. Nundro, where they'll recite 100,000, they call them miksemas, where it's like a prayer to Lama Tsongkhapa. And his Holiness said, he said something like, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he said, I personally think it's better to actually read the works of Lama Tsongkhapa. He said, if you put the time into reading those, then you'll understand what he actually thought. And you'll sort of have some insight to that. And then he said, whereas if you just say the words, then it may not have as much meaning. So he said, I think it's better if you read the works of him. So he wasn't saying don't do Nundro or something, but you're sort of saying you have to, to study is more important.
Hey, Laura, but I don't know if I remember this, but those 5 major works from Lama Tsongkhapa, only 2 of them are translated, right?
No, they're all in English now.
They're all now? Oh.
Yeah, the 5 are, one is the first one I think he wrote, again I forget the order, well the first 2 that he wrote, I think he wrote first Essence of Eloquence, which Bob Thurman translated. It's I think called Essential Philosophy of Tibet is one of the titles. It's been published twice, so one might be called Essence of Eloquence, and then the other edition was called Central Philosophy of Tibet. But Bob Thurman translated that one. And Jeffrey Hopkins also, he translated that book, just the sections on the mind-only school. He didn't translate the middle way school section. So you can read, Jeffrey Hopkins actually translated the sections on the mind-only school along with a ton of commentaries, really very deep. Whereas Bob Thurman then translated the whole book, but just the book. So there's that one. Another one is the emptiness section of the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path, which is in the 3-volume, there's a 3-volume edition of that whole Lam Rim. And the emptiness section is in the last volume of that. Then another one of the 5 is Ocean of Reasoning is the translation in English, and it's a big thick book, and it's Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to Nagarjuna's text called Wisdom, or the Majjhimaka Karika. So, and that's Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to Nagarjuna's own treatise. So that's the 3rd of the 5. Then this text will be another, right? So this is 4.
The middle length?
Middle length Lam Rims, emptiness section. And then the other one is actually what Khenchen Rinpoche has been basing his commentary here at the center on when he's teaching Majjhimaka Avatara. It's Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to the Majjhimaka Avatara, which is, in English you call it, they different translations of that title, but usually, I think probably the most accurate one is called Supplements in the Middle Way. So in other words, Chandrakirti wrote a supplement in the Nagarjuna's text.
Well, that was like the chapter 6?
Yeah, he's been teaching chapter 6 of. So the whole book of that is called Illumination of Thought. And that actually, FPMT has a complete translation, which I sent out to people who are attending Khenchen Rinpoche's teaching. So there is a translation of that. And then Thupten Jinpa, though, the Dalai Lama's translator, is coming out soon, I guess, with a kind of more definitive translation by himself.
Of that text?
Of that text.
Oh.
So right now it's not published, but FPMT does have a translation, and soon it'll be published by Wisdom Publications that Thupten Jinpa translated. So all 5 have been translated, actually.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and they're wonderful. If you, I mean, they're really wonderful. All of them are wonderful texts. So yeah. And then one more kind of introductory remark. Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't start with this, but I just wanted to very briefly. Usually when Khenchen Rinpoche teaches on emptiness, and he did it in the Easy Path, but he does it almost every time he teaches on emptiness. He mentions that just trying to understand emptiness, so we're about to spend quite a while studying emptiness, and so when Khenchen Rinpoche teaches on it, he often says this point. He says, just trying to study emptiness has humongous benefits. And so I'll just read a couple of quotes. He quotes the sutra bestowed to Kumara Ratnadatta, in which the Buddha said, Manjushri, If someone listens to this teaching, even with doubt, that one accumulates more merit than a bodhisattva practicing the 6 perfections for hundreds of thousands of eons without skillful means. What need is there to mention if someone listens to it without doubt? So what he's saying there, right, is that without skillful means without the understanding of emptiness. So he's saying if you practice the 6 perfections for thousands of eons without understanding emptiness, it's not as it wouldn't have the same benefit or same merit as just trying to study this, even with doubt. Right? Then he says, if you don't have doubt, then all the better. Then he quotes the Sutra of the Tathagata's Treasury, in which the Buddha said that if someone had committed all the 10 non-virtuous actions and then intensively enters into studying emptiness or selflessness, that sentient being will not, that karma will not ripen and then go into lower realms. Then he quotes the Sutra of Ajatasattu, in which the Buddha said, quote, if someone has committed the 5 uninterrupted negative actions and later hears, enter into, and generates faith in this Dharma, then I do not call that person's karma a karmic obscuration. So what he's saying is, like, it purifies so much karma to study emptiness. Right? And then Aryadeva, there's a very famous quote by Aryadeva. So Aryadeva was Nagarjuna's most famous student. There's a very famous quote from Aryadeva's 400 stanzas in which he says, those of little merit have no doubts about this Dharma. Even by merely generating a doubt, samsara is torn to tatters. And so what they're getting at there, the main point of all of that, is that one is they're saying you purify a lot of negative karma and create a lot of merit by studying this topic, just by trying to study it. But then they're also saying something else, which is, like, without understanding emptiness, there's no other, there is, from a Buddhist perspective, it's only through understanding emptiness that one can become free from samsara. And there's absolutely no other way. Like, you know, the reason I was out in California, Khenpo Rinpoche was teaching on Mahamudra, the section on emptiness. And he was quoting the Panchen Lama. The Panchen Lama said, there's only one door to liberation from samsara, and that door is the teaching on dependent origination and emptiness in harmony. And he said, there is no other way to be liberated. And that's the Buddhist perspective on the nature of liberation. And we're going to get into that in this section soon, actually. But, you know, so the idea is that only by understanding emptiness can one become enlightened. And then also, this point about doubt. What they're getting at there is also, that comes from the teachings on valid cognition in Buddhism. And the point is this, is that, you know, we all start off, right, with ignorance. And wisdom is the opposite of ignorance. And one teaching in the teachings on valid cognition is that, you know, the first step, actually, towards wisdom is doubt. You know, so in other words, if you're grasping at an idea that's wrong, you know, it's almost Socratic, isn't it? That the first step towards gaining wisdom is starting to go, well, maybe that's wrong. And then you start to go, wow, I kind of think that's wrong. And what Aryadeva is saying here, the kind of doubt he's talking about is that. So we grasp at a sense of inherently existent self. And what Aryadeva is saying is that moment, if you're studying emptiness, there comes a moment where you go, wow, maybe that inherently existent, independent self doesn't exist. Wow, really, that's weird. So you kind of have some feeling. Right? Like you start to doubt that the self you grasp at exists. And he's saying that doubt creates a kind of, is part of a process of gaining wisdom that eventually tears samsara to shreds, right, or to tatters, because samsara is founded on ignorance, right? And so the wisdom understanding emptiness is the only thing that can tear that to shreds. So we have to understand emptiness in order to become liberated, in order to become enlightened, and so on. Okay, so that's just like introduction. Then, how Lama Tsongkhapa, so this text kind of has an outline, so it starts, I'll just mention, so he says this whole final section of the text is going to have 4 divisions. One is, what are the prerequisites for special insight? The divisions of special insight, how to actually cultivate it, right, the practices, and then the measure of success, right, the measure of telling whether you successfully practice it. So he starts with the prerequisites, and he takes them from Kamala Shiva's stages of meditation. But so there are a number of prerequisites that he's getting at here, and actually, well, just a few, and he keeps it quite simple, actually. One is he says, Well, actually, I'll say all three. So it says, rely on holy beings, seek to hear the Dharma from holy beings, and reflect on it properly. And so what he's getting at there really is this, first point, rely on holy beings. What that really means is that emptiness is first of all, like emptiness is, this idea of things are dependently arisen and therefore empty of intrinsic existence, or is unique. Right? That's actually, they say many other things in Buddhism are in other, right? The teachings on love, or I mean, Buddha emphasized love, but so do other traditions, and teachings on calm abiding that we just covered. Right? Everybody, I mean, the Buddhist tradition itself says the Hindu tradition has that also. It's not unique to Buddhism. So there are many teachings in Buddhism that are not unique to Buddhism, but the teaching on dependent origination and emptiness is totally unique. There's no other tradition that teaches that. And part of what they're getting at here when they say rely on holy beings is that, so we're not going to understand, the teaching on emptiness is very subtle. It's very, subtle, that's a good word to put it. And it's not an easy one to understand. So what they're saying is you're not going to understand on your own. That you have to rely on a holy being, meaning someone who themselves has understood the practice, has understood this subject, and has had some experience of it, and so on. So somebody like Kensho Rinpoche, right? And actually, I'll say that's the reason. It's this point is the reason why I kept asking Kensho Rinpoche to teach Majjhima Kavatar for a few, because it says in the teachings you have to rely on somebody like that. Does that make sense? Somebody who's somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I mean, there are many great teachers, but you have to rely on a great teacher to understand emptiness, because it's a difficult topic. Then the second one is, it's not enough to just rely on them, you have to then listen to the teachings on this topic from them, right? So, because they may teach other topics, but if they don't teach this topic, then you understand this topic. And part of the point here is that you're starting to get at, there are different kinds of wisdom, right? So you develop the wisdom, first you develop the wisdom of listening, or study, right? And so that comes, there what happens actually, you'll have this experience if you listen to great teachers teach, if you listen to Kensho Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, many great teachers. If you listen to them teach on emptiness and you pay close attention and you think about what they're saying as they're talking, there come points where you gain some kind of insight. Makes sense? Like you're listening and you're kind of trying to understand, you go, oh wow, it's like that. Oh wow, oh, I think I get this idea. You have like some experience like that, right? And what they say is that's the wisdom that comes through listening. And the point is that the wisdom that comes through listening is through the power, it's through your own listening, but it's also through someone else's power at that point. Does that make sense? It's like this other person, for example, in the center here, so that Kensho Rinpoche will be teaching. And if you've studied some, you've read some of the book, and you're really listening, you'll have these moments where you gain some partial understanding. And that's the wisdom of listening. So it's possible to achieve that, right? You start to achieve that wisdom of listening. But the wisdom of listening is like, it's mainly reliant on the other person, right? So their words, what they're saying, or if you're reading, it could be afterwards, you're reading the text, and you start to, oh wow, so it's like intellectual. First of all, it's an intellectual level of knowledge. It's kind of an intellectual understanding, and it comes about through the power of the other person's explanation. And that's very powerful. That's the first step, right? And we need to develop the wisdom of listening. Then he's saying, after having, in addition to having listened, not necessarily after, because it could be a back and forth process, right? He says, reflect on it properly, right? So that means contemplate the teachings. So that's where then you have to, what he's saying here, if you want to understand emptiness, you have to then go off on your own and think deeply, right? And here you have to think intellectually, but it's more than intellectual. You actually have to sort of bring up your own wrong understandings, your misunderstandings, and sort of debate with them and analyze them and say, well, part of me thinks it's you bring up your own doubts, your own confusions, and you think deeply, right? And you analyze deeply using logic and using the teachings you've heard. And the idea here is that then you gradually start to develop a new kind of wisdom, the wisdom that arises through your own contemplation. And there's a difference between that and the wisdom of listening. One of the differences is it's not reliant upon another at that point, right? It's reliant upon your own process internally. So you're not listening at that point. You're sitting alone and you're sort of contemplating. You may take a verse or two from the teachings and then you sit and think about them. Or you may think back to something your teacher said or something Lama Tsongkhapa said, but then you start analyzing it. And here, it's the force of your own reasoning that becomes your teacher. Does that make sense? So it's your own experience, and they say you rely on both experience and reason in your own analysis, and you develop a kind of understanding based on your own contemplation. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is you have to do those 3 steps. Then you can meditate on emptiness. If you try to meditate on emptiness before doing these things, there's nothing to meditate on because you don't understand what emptiness is. And so you can't meditate on emptiness correctly, and that's where then you get people, like Lama Tsongkhapa in other parts of the text says, otherwise like people will just sort of blank their mind out and think they're meditating on emptiness. He says that's not emptiness at all. Emptiness is a very specific thing, which he's going to explain what it is, but you'll only understand that if you do these first 3 steps. So rely on a holy being, listen to them teach on emptiness, and contemplate or reflect on the meaning. And then he says here, he's just clarifying, right? He says, it is an indispensable, right? So he's saying indispensable, you know what the word indispensable is, right? It's an indispensable causal prerequisite of special insight to develop the view realizing suchness by means of the wisdom of hearing and reflecting. Having heard the stainless texts in dependence upon experts who unmistakably know the essential points of the scriptures. Okay? And so what he's getting, a special insight itself is a wisdom that arises through meditation. Right? Whereas that arises in your meditative experience, but he's saying it's indispensable. There's no other way than to first study with a holy being, contemplate, listen to them on this topic, contemplate the meaning, gain a kind of intellectual or conceptual insight, and then you go meditate on that, and you gradually will develop special insight. Yeah.
If you're reading Lama Tsongkhapa's text or Concern or something, is that studying with the holy being, or is it?
Yeah, I mean the tradition would be. Actually, I was asking Ken Shermishay about that, and what he said, he was very interested. Like I was saying, one day I was asking him that kind of question, and he said 2 different things. One was, he was saying, one thing he said, which I thought was interesting, is he said, even Atisha, who was the originator of the Lamrim literature, he said even Atisha, when he was in Tibet, said, what's the word? Like he said something like, oh, I have, if I stop studying texts, it's not supportive of my own development. Like, so you're saying even Atisha continued to study, which isn't good. But then Khenpo Rinpoche said, and it's through your own study of reading, say, texts by someone like Lama Tsongkhapa, he said, then when you see your teacher and they teach, you'll understand it better. So what he was getting at there is it has to be a dialect. There's like, we can spend a lot of time studying on our own, but then we have to go also to teachers. Like if we're trying to understand something as complex and subtle as emptiness, that we still have to go to teachers to ask them questions, to hear them explain some. And if we've studied a lot on our own on this topic, then it'll be easier to kind of gain insight from what they're explaining. So you have to do kind of, so ideally you would do both, or you have to kind of do some, at least some amount of both if you really want to understand this topic. I think that's kind of what Rinpoche was saying. Does that make sense? And then Tsongkhapa says another thing here. He says, this is because if you lack the view that has resolved the meaning of the mode of being, it will be impossible for the realization of special insight that realizes things as they are to arise. Right? So things as they are means the ultimate nature or the reality of things. And what he's implying there is true, right, as part of this point, which is that special insight into emptiness comes about initially in reliance upon, what do you call it, stainless reasoning, right? So it's actually a reasoning process. The Dalai Lama often emphasizes that, right? In other words, that you gain a realization, actually, that's conceptual through correct reasons. And if you haven't studied the reasons, you can't do that. So that's the nature of sort of progressing in the understanding of emptiness. And then he makes another point. He says, such a view must be sought by one who is relying not on the interpretable meaning, but on the definitive meaning of the scriptures. And so this is important too, so I'll just say, actually one point I'll make is that text, The Essence of Eloquence by Lama Tsongkhapa, another title of that is, or part of the subtitle of that is something like, discriminating between the definitive and interpretable meanings of the teachings of the Buddha, actually. So that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is addressing in that text, is that point. And part of the point here that is, I think, useful for us to think about if we want to study emptiness is this. What he's saying here is you can't just rely on the words of the Buddha alone. Because the Buddha, like, let's say right. First of all, the Buddha said different things for different types of disciples. Like, in other words, depending on a person's level of development, the Buddha presented things in different ways to suit that student. And so if you just take every word literally, that's not sufficient to understand emptiness. And so what he's saying, there's a whole teaching that Lama Tsongkhapa goes into in that other text, where he makes this point. He says, so if the Buddha sometimes said, there is a self, and sometimes said, a teaching on no self, and so on, he gave different teachings, right, for different students. Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, how can you determine which is true, right? Which of the teachings are provisional, are useful at a certain level, and which are the ultimate meaning of the Buddha, or the ultimate intent of the Buddha? And he says, well, the only way to do that is to rely on reason. Like, and the Dalai Lama always says that, right? That we have to rely on analysis and reasoning. And that's the Buddhist tradition, right? The Buddhist tradition is not one of blind faith. It's one of faith grounded in reason, and ultimately a kind of reasoned conclusion. And so in studying emptiness, that's what we have to do. And you'll see when you study the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa on this topic, for example, he'll say, like, for example, a Sangha, right? There are two great, they call them the two great trailblazers of the Mahayana, right? One was Nagarjuna, another was a Sangha. And the Sangha taught these amazing texts, right? Wonderful, like amazing treatises on Buddhist teachings that Lama Tsongkhapa has quoted throughout the book many times, right? He loves the Sangha, you can see. But a Sangha also taught the mind-only school's view of emptiness. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that's an extremely wonderful, valuable doctrine. That's not the ultimate intent of the Buddha. And he says, and how can he say that? Well, you compare the teachings of Nagarjuna, the teachings of Sangha, and you say which one holds up to reasoned analysis, and then he comes to the conclusion, right? The teachings of Sangha that assert the mind-only school are a useful tool for people who are not yet ready to study the teachings of Nagarjuna, but they're not the ultimate intent. The ultimate intent is the teachings of Nagarjuna. So it's based on reason. Does that make sense? And there's no other way to determine that, because you can't say, well, this scripture is consistent with that scripture, but this one's consistent with this one, and it would just go on endlessly, right? And they are all, they're all things that were actually taught by the Buddha or by Buddhist masters. So we have to ultimately rely on reason, is part of the point here. And then he says here, therefore, you need to understand the difference between interpretable and definitive meanings, and understand the meaning of the scriptures of definitive meaning. And then he says, again, with this, if you do not rely on a treatise by one of the great, valid, trailblazing founders, which elucidates the Buddha's intentions, you will be like a blind person without a guide, going off in a dreadful direction. Therefore, you should rely upon a non-mistaken commentary. And part of the point to that is and this is actually true, like, if in ancient Buddhist times this was true, and it's still true, actually. I remember this when I was in, college. Like, if you start to read, different texts by different scholars, where they all will, say they're trying to look at the Prajnaparamita Sutra, or even at the original verses of Nagarjuna, they make up people, because they're difficult to understand. They're ambiguous texts. Does that make sense? Like, the words are ambiguous, right? Even the Heart Sutra, you know that, right? It says no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. Well, what does that mean, right? You say, well, of course I have eyes and ears. That has no, so then you say, well, so is there, okay, then they're not real and there's no eyes anywhere. That's silly, right? But people interpret it that way, right? And people interpret Nagarjuna, actually modern scholars do. You can sometimes find actual books, right, where somebody says, Nagarjuna is saying nothing exists at all. Well, that's just wrong. So if we don't, so he's saying here you have to rely on a non-mistaken commentary. So in other words, these difficult texts, that's why Swami was saying study the works of Lama Tsongkhapa, then go back and study. Actually it's funny, if you really want to study well, I think it's like, you might study if you study with Kensho Rinpoche, then eventually you can understand a text by Lama Tsongkhapa. Then if you study Lama Tsongkhapa's text, you can eventually understand Chandrakirti's text. If you understand Chandrakirti's text, then you can finally go to Nagarjuna's text and understand it. It's kind of like that, actually. And so we need these commentaries, is the point, if you want to correctly understand those original sources. And if you understand Nagarjuna, then you can open the Prajnaparamita and go, oh, this makes sense. Right? Otherwise, if you read the Prajnaparamita Sutras, it's difficult to understand what they mean. And now, then he gives a history of the Madhyamaka, a brief history, actually. And so he says, who should you rely on? And then he says, on Arya Nagarjuna, widely renowned throughout the three levels. So the three levels means like the earth, the sky, and the subterranean realms. He's saying everywhere, basically. And then he makes a point, and there are many other texts, he doesn't go into detail here, and some of the other texts he actually goes into detail about this. He says the Buddha prophesied Nagarjuna. So there are many like treatises where he said, the Buddha said, in the future there will be a student with that name and so on. But what he's saying here is this, so there are many different, actually there are many different people who wrote about, emptiness, selflessness. But, and actually I'll just pause there, like Nagarjuna, right? Actually, from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, I was thinking about this after I read this last night. I think actually it's fair to say, apart from the Buddha himself, there's no more important figure in Mahayana Buddhist history than Nagarjuna, really. Because if you look at like the Chan and tradition of China, the Zen tradition of Japan, they trace their lineage back to Nagarjuna. If you look at the Buddhism of Tibet, Mongolia, Bhutan, all those northern sort of what do you call it? Nepal, the Central Asian traditions of Buddhism, they all rely on Nagarjuna as the ultimate explicator of the view. And so if you look at, kind of, because, like the northern traditions of Buddhism tend to be where the Mahayana spread, and then there are southern. So Nagarjuna is mostly famous and relied on the Mahayana traditions. But I don't think you couldn't really say there's anybody, apart from the Buddha himself, who's a more important figure in Mahayana Buddhist history than Nagarjuna. And then in terms of the view, he was the founder, right? Lama Tsongkhapa mentioned two trailblazers, right? So I said that. So the first of the trailblazers, in a way, was that term, if I use that term, was Nagarjuna, and the second was the Sangha. And they say Nagarjuna founded the middle way school, the Madhyamaka, or middle way school, and a Sangha founded the mind-only, mind-only school of Buddhist philosophy. And they're probably the two most important figures in Mahayana Buddhist history in North India. Actually Nagarjuna is from southern India, but then he lived in northern India because he was like a teacher at Nalanda Monastic University, and that's where he wrote some of his texts and so on. Okay, so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying you need to rely, if you want to understand emptiness correctly, the definitive meaning is the meaning explicated by Nagarjuna. And I'm just going to keep going with this history a little bit, because that's Lama Tsongkhapa's next thing. So he says, since the great Madhyamakas, so what he's getting at here is, actually I'll just say it this way. So Nagarjuna, they call him a trailblazer because he started this, the school of Madhyamaka, middle way. Then his closest student was Aryadeva, famous Buddhist master who wrote the 400 verses, that verse including the one I just mentioned, right? Even doubt tears samsara to shreds. And what they say actually is that all Madhyamaka philosophers after the two of them sort of look back on both Nagarjuna and Aryadeva are accepted as like sort of definitive by all Madhyamaka philosophers. And so like their texts, he says here, some people call them the original texts or the model texts. So they're sort of the fundamental texts, you could say, of this tradition. So the texts of Nagarjuna, which are many, he wrote many texts, and then the texts of Aryadeva, they're these sort of foundational texts. And I'll just briefly kind of describe. So then what happened was, after them, again, people were trying to interpret what they had said. Does that make sense? Like, what did Nagarjuna mean? And so it said that Buddhapalita, who was this great Indian Buddhist master, he wrote a commentary to Nagarjuna's text that's actually considered to be, by most scholars, to be the founding of the Prasangika, or consequentialist school of philosophy. Then he mentions here Bhava Viveka, who was another great Buddhist philosopher, disagreed with Buddhapalita on certain points. And so he founded the sub-school called the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school, in which he disagreed with Buddhapalita. And he wrote some texts like that. Following after him, there's another teacher mentioned here, Shantarakshita. And he came to Tibet, actually, and his student was Kamalashila. But anyway, so Shantarakshita kind of agreed with Baba Viveka, but kind of gave a mind-only, his school is called the Chittamatra Svatantrika Madhyamaka, right? Because his view was that he was a Madhyamaka in the sense that he said that things lack inherent existence, or actually lack true existence, or lack independent existence, let's put it that way. But he said that external objects don't exist. Whereas Baba Viveka had said external objects do conventionally exist. So they had a slight difference. But anyway, and then Chandrakirti, who's considered kind of by Tibetans to be the most definitive writer on the topic, he, as Lama Tsongkhapa will say in a little bit, he agreed with Buddhapalita, wrote the Madhyamaka Avatara, the Prasnapada, these various texts. But anyway, he sort of really explicated the Prasangika or consequentialist school's view. He disagreed with Baba Viveka on certain points and refuted them while borrowing the good things from Baba Viveka, and sort of wrote these definitive texts on the consequentialist or Prasangika school. So that's a kind of brief history. And Shantideva actually comes from the tradition of Chandrakirti. So Shantideva's texts on emptiness are considered kind of definitive as well in the tradition of Chandrakirti. Now Lama Tsongkhapa kind of talks about how people categorize these things. A little bit more about that. So he says, here he's saying, so in the next paragraph he's pointing out that some people sort of talk about, and this is a way of talking about it, that there are some Madhyamakas, right? So Madhyamaka means middle way, right? Philosopher. So he's saying some Madhyamaka philosophers differentiate according to that he uses the word Sautandrika Madhyamakas. So he says Sautandrika Madhyamakas say external objects do conventionally exist, whereas Yogacara Madhyamakas say external objects don't exist. That they're mind only, that things are mind only. So they're sort of using an aspect of the mind only school, but they're not mind only philosophers because they ultimately say the mind doesn't. They, according to this way of describing it, actual mind only philosophers believe that the mind has true existence, isn't empty of inherent existence, of true existence. Whereas middle way philosophers say it is empty of true existence. So here, what he's saying is there are some Madhyamaka, Yogacara Madhyamakas, who would say external objects don't exist, and also the mind ultimately doesn't exist. So they're Madhyamakas, but they also refute external objects, whereas Sautandrika Madhyamakas say there are conventional external objects. So he's saying that's one way of differentiating. It's getting a little complicated, right? He gets worse, exactly. Then he says, they also, more so. Then he says another way of differentiating it, so that's according to how conventional things are established, right? Do external conventional things exist or not? Then he says another way of differentiating these things is in terms of how they assert ultimates. And that will be discussed more below, so I'm not going to go into detail about that because I think it will just get more confusing. But what they're getting at is just, how do conventional things exist is another way some people have posited this. And then Lama Tsongkhapa quotes, he says, the great translator Loden Sherab, so I'm on page 240 for those who are following the text, but he says, the great translator Loden Sherab says, positing them as two groups from the point of view of how they assert the ultimate is an obscured presentation generating amazement. So what he's saying is that second explanation in terms of differentiating them according to how they posit the ultimate nature of existence is incorrect. So that's why I won't go into detail about it because you guys are, I don't think people are familiar with it, but he's just saying that's not a correct differentiation. And now he's getting into, so what is a correct way to talk about the Madhyamaka? Correct way to talk about the Madhyamaka subdivisions. That's what I'll call it. The subdivisions of the Madhyamaka. And this is the important point here. Well, he goes into what I said there. So he's saying and this is the master Yeshe De, who was a great Nyingma master, who Lama Tsongkhapa is agreeing with here. And he says, in the Madhyamaka treatises by the noble father Nagarjuna and his spiritual son Aryadeva, it is not made clear whether external objects exist or not. Part of that, I'll just pause there, part of the reason for that is they wrote those texts, right? Nagarjuna and Aryadeva wrote their core texts before Asanga's time, before Asanga started the mind-only school. So they didn't address, they weren't trying to refute Asanga's position because Asanga hadn't asserted it yet. Right? So they were just explaining the meaning of emptiness. Then when Asanga came along and started saying, from a mind-only perspective, external objects don't exist as a separate entity from consciousness, right? So then Madhyamaka philosophers had to contend with or deal with Asanga's assertions. Does that make sense? Asanga was such a great philosopher that these philosophers then had to kind of address that. Right? But Nagarjuna and Aryadeva hadn't addressed it in their writings because they wrote before that time. Does that make sense? So it's not addressed by them. So Master Baba Viveka came along, and he refuted the mind-only school. Right? He sort of was explaining Nagarjuna's intent, and at the same time he was saying the mind-only school is wrong and Nagarjuna is right. Then Shantarakshita followed, as I was mentioning, followed after Viveka, and he said, well, he liked some aspects of mind-only school, so he integrated them into the Madhyamaka, but as it says here, he said that basically he made a different Madhyamaka system based on the mind-only or Yogacara school, teaching that external objects do not exist conventionally, and that ultimately mind is without inherent existence. Right? So he kind of integrated a little bit of elements of the mind-only school with Nagarjuna's philosophy of lack of inherent existence. And so he's saying, so Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying, so one correct way, based on this master Yeshe De's differentiation, that there is a correct way of differentiating Madhyamakas by saying, well, some assert that external objects don't even exist conventionally. Others say external objects do exist conventionally. So that's a reasonable way to interpret, a reasonable way to differentiate different Madhyamaka philosophers, and one could use that as a tool to sort of differentiate sub-schools of Madhyamaka. Then he says, but there's a problem. And the problem is Chandrakirti. Right? And he's saying Chandrakirti asserts that external objects do exist conventionally. But he's not a Sautantrika. And he actually refuted Sautantrika. Right? So if you try to if you say, well, there are Sautantrikas who assert that external objects do exist conventionally, and there are Yogacara Madhyamakas who say they don't exist conventionally, then you have a problem because Chandrakirti says external objects do exist conventionally, but he's not a Yogacara philosopher because he disagrees with the mind-only school's interpretations, and he's also not a Sautantrika because he actually specifically refuted the Sautantrika school. So he's saying if you only rely on this differentiation of, you get what I mean, Sautantrika Madhyamakas who assert that external objects do exist conventionally, and Yogacara Madhyamakas who say they don't, then Chandrakirti doesn't fit into either category. So there's a little bit of a problem still. So then Lama Tsongkhapa says, gives another way of differentiating them. So he says the scholars of later propagation of the teachings in the land of snow, so this is saying we Tibetans had to create another way of talking about this, or another categorization. And he differentiated, so therefore they differentiated Svatantrika Madhyamakas and Prasangika Madhyamakas. And he's saying, so the Prasangika Madhyamaka school is the school of Chandrakirti. That also, the Tibetans usually say Buddhapala was also a Prasangika, and Shantideva and so on. And what's important here, I think, I mean, this is getting a little technical, I think, but it's emptiness, so it's going to be technical. There's no way around it. Is that from most Tibetan, most of the Tibetan traditions agree on this, not all, but most, and the Glukpa tradition certainly does. The Prasangika perspective on emptiness is the most definitive, the most subtle, the most correct. It's the ultimate intent. When Lama Tsongkhapa earlier said you have to differentiate between the interpretable and definitive meaning, Chandrakirti's position, the Prasangika position, is considered to be the definitive meaning of the Buddha, of the Buddha's teachings on emptiness. And maybe I won't go into, I mean, I could say more about that, but maybe I won't for now. Yeah, I won't say more yet. So then he goes on to say one point, which he says, you know, he's kind of addressing this point about, so he's relying on Chandrakirti, right? Then he's saying, you know, this whole Lamrim tradition comes from Atisha, right? We said that at the very beginning of the whole treatise, that the whole Lamrim tradition begins with Atisha. And so Lama's Tsongkhapa here makes the point, he says, Atisha, you know, he says, why, he says, following which of these masters do you seek the intention of Nagarjuna and Aryadeva? And then he says, following the great elder, it means Atisha. So following Atisha, who made Chandrakirti system, the main Madhyamaka system, the earlier great masters of these instructions also held this system as the main one. So he's saying, not only did Shantideva agree with Chandrakirti, but Atisha agreed with Chandrakirti in terms of the ultimate meaning of emptiness. And he says, so we're also going to follow Atisha's advice, which is to use the interpretation of Chandrakirti as definitive. And then he says, Chandrakirti agreed with Buddhipalada's interpretation of Nagarjuna's text, and he also borrowed the correct parts of Baba Viveka's presentation, he says, while refuting those that seem slightly incorrect. So, he, you know, and there actually, you'll see that in certain texts if you read Nagarjuna, where, I mean, if you read Chandrakirti rather, where he actually, I mean, Baba Viveka was a great philosopher, and Chandrakirti uses some of Baba Viveka's arguments, but there are certain points where he says, on this particular point, Baba Viveka was wrong. And one of those, maybe I will not say that, you know, the word prasangika, right, this word in Sanskrit, prasangika, which is what we use as the name for his school, means consequences, or consequentialist, right, like a user of consequences. And they say, they use sometimes translate, Jeffrey Hopkins translates prasangikas as consequentialists, as compared to the Svatantrikas, who he translates as like those who rely on autonomous syllogisms. So it's a kind of logic. And part of the point, though, is this, is one of the differences between them is that, and you'll see this as we go forward, so that's why I mention it now, is that Chandrakirti emphasized a certain kind of reasoning. And that kind of reasoning is interesting. This is kind of understandable, I think, and useful. That Chandrakirti emphasized a certain kind of reasoning, which is you take, whether it's your own position or somebody else's position, but let's assume it's our own, right? So you look at sort of a way that something appears to you and that you think, right? And you feel like, oh, this is true, right? I believe this is true. And what Chandrakirti does is he relies on a kind of reasoning where you look at the absurd consequences. So you say, well, if this is true, what are the implications of that? And if you come to a point where you realize, wow, this thing I think is true has totally absurd consequences, so it's totally illogical, then you have to abandon that position. Does that make sense? And actually it's a kind of reasoning that, that Chandrakirti relied on heavily, but if you remember, if you studied it in school, Socrates also sometimes relied on that mode of reasoning, right? It's a mode of reasoning where you keep questioning a certain position until you find its absurd consequences, and then you realize it's an absurd position, right? And then you abandon that position. And what he's saying there, in part, what Chandrakirti was getting at in part, is to gain insight into emptiness, if you look at your own self-grasping, right, your own grasping at a truly existent self, experientially, and you look at its nature, right? And then, so for example, I'll just give a very simple example of what we're talking about, right? If you say to yourself, if you feel like there's a real me who's sitting right now, right? We're all sitting down. So if you feel there's a real me that's sitting, right? So then you have to say, well, okay, so there's a real you that's sitting. That's your position, right? Now, a consequentialist reasoning would say, well, so is the you that's sitting? Is it the body sits? So is the you that's sitting the body? Because the mind doesn't sit, right? So are you independent of your mind? Does your mind have nothing to do with you? And then sometimes you'll say, well, my body's sitting. So, you know, and then so but you say, oh no, but I said I'm sitting. Right, so that means I'm my body. So if you were, so like, then is a corpse a person? Right, a corpse could sit, but it has no consciousness, right? Also then if you say like, I'm thinking, like, oh, I'm remembering, I'm listening to talk, to a discussion, well then you'd say, well, wait a second, that's my, like, that's partly my ear, but partly my mind, right? So which is it? Am I my body or my mind? You see, you have to start analyzing. And if you come to the point where you say, well, and then there's parts of the body. So is one part of your body you? Because you said, I'm sitting, right? So if you say, oh, I'm my body. Well, are you your whole body or are you part of your body? Right? And you start analyzing. And if eventually you come to a recognition, well, to say I'm just my body or that I'm just a part of my body isn't a tenable position, then you have to let go of then the experience, that original feeling, I'm sitting, you recognize, well, that was incorrect. That there's an ultimate me sitting. You know. Anyway, my point is that Chandrakirti's approach is to look for absurd consequences in order to abandon a position. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you just say at the end there that there's an ultimate you sitting, or you're refuting that?
You're refuting that there's an ultimate you sitting.
Right.
Yeah, and Chandrakirti would say, if you just, you know, yeah, anyway, that's enough. I won't get into more details, I'll say it later, but yeah, no, there's no, so you're refuting that there is any ultimate
Yeah, I
you
just
sitting.
misunderstood.
Yeah. No, I may have said it wrong too. But, okay, so that's the difference, is that this Prasangika school, so he's saying we're going to rely on them, and they're consequentialists. So they rely on consequences. They rely on absurd consequences. One of the things they do, not only this, but often they'll rely on absurd consequences to a position to refute that position.
So how do you say like sugar? If you say like sugar.
Sugar?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Absurd consequences. Consequences of sugar. What is it? What is?
I think Chandrakirti would say,
Yeah.
there's no problem, there's sugar.
The sugar.
Because you're not saying there's the issue is it inherently existent sugar, or is it some kind of, if you just say, because Chandrakirti is not at refuting all conventional phenomena, what he is doing is when you try to assert an ultimate, that's what he's refuting. So in other words, he's not refuting that people exist, or that sugar exists, or that rooms exist. He's refuting an ultimate nature, right? So like, for example, if you say sugar exists and it's sweet, then, and you're not doing ultimate analysis, then he would say, yeah, that's right, pass the sugar. You know, there's no problem.
What about the taste of the sugar?
And if you say, oh, it tastes sweet, then that's fine, right? But the problem becomes if you start to say, if you were to say this is real sugar from its own side, then there's a problem. See, if you say, oh, I like sugar, sugar's sweet, please pass the sugar, that's conventional discourse. It's a conventional discussion, and Chandrakirti would leave that alone, actually. But if you were to say this is really sugar from its own side, right? Well, then, for example, it's very easy, right? You'd say, well, sugar is made up of, I forget the chemical, I don't know, what's, you know, the...
Sodium chloride.
Sodium chloride. If you look at the chemical, you know, the atomic particles in it, which one of those is sugar? Right? Is sugar one of those? Is sugar one part of the atom? Is it the nucleus, for example? Or is it the electrons of an atom? Then you have a problem, right? Because you can't say an electron is sugar. You can't say a proton is sugar. I'm giving you an example, right?
Yeah.
So if we don't analyze it, we just say sugar is sweet, pass the sugar, then there's no problem. But if you start to say it's sugar from its own side, then he says, well, then you have to analyze it. If it's truly sugar from its own side, it should be findable.
Can make you sick.
Yeah, that's true. But that's still conventional, so it's okay. Yeah. Somebody else.
No, I was just commenting, like, so we kind of do that analysis is that, like the consequentialist, it's like so you're actually sort of only going into that when you're questioning like inherent existence,
yeah,
ultimate, existence. So the analysis is I don't want to get ahead, but sort of like the analysis that you would do with like self, then you would kind of do the same analysis with phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And one point, just to support what you're saying, a couple of things. One is Chandrakirti and this Prasangika school are not denying that things exist. Things do exist. That's one thing, right? Whereas if you deny things exist at all, that would be nihilism, which is the opposite, which is completely unacceptable to Chandrakirti or Nagarjuna. That's one point. And then a second point, in Chandrakirti's system, one thing he says is, and it's just a point of what you're saying, Gabe, Chandrakirti makes a very clear point. He says, when it comes to conventional reality, right, he says, one should not engage in ultimate analysis. That ultimate analysis is only relevant when you're questioning the ultimate status of things. You know, and it's like, so it's like that thing of, you know, it's like if somebody were to say, you know, if you showed somebody a painting of a tree, right, and you said, oh, that's a tree, right, if the person were then saying, no, that's not a tree, it's a painting of a tree, well, they're just being stupid, right, like, in other words, that's not the level of discourse being discussed. We're not having an ultimate, you know, like, it's like if you're in, you know, if I say, oh, there's a tree in that painting, well, oh, look, there's a, you know, a tree, like, oh, no, that's a painting of a tree, right, like, it's just linguistic, right, it's just a conventional discussion. Now, if you're going to ask, is there ultimately a truly existent tree from its own side there, then that's a valid question. Then you start to analyze. So what he's saying is, in conventional reality, if somebody's saying pass the sugar, you don't say, well, which subatomic particle are you referring to? Like, it's not the correct level of discourse, level of discussion. So what he's saying is, Chandrakirti makes a whole point. He says, when talking about just normal, everyday, conventional realities, it's incorrect to engage in ultimate analysis. The time to engage, you know, and that when you're trying to analyze the ultimate status of something, when you're meditating on emptiness, that's when you engage in these kinds of analyses. And so, yeah, so he differentiates when to and when not to engage in ultimate analysis. And the time for that kind of analysis is when you're trying to understand the ultimate nature of something.
Yeah. So then we don't. So there's no need to analyze conventional phenomena.
Yeah, one thing I think of is like Nagarjuna actually has. Chandrakirti has this point where he says, yeah, there's a whole subtle distinction where they get at. How should I say it the right way? Like that there's like. Actually, there's a famous line in Chandrakirti where he says, when it comes to the details of conventional reality, I leave that to the world to decide. You know, and then he says, when it comes to the ultimate status, that's where he's special, you know, that's where he's going to analyze. And what he's getting at is like, you know, if somebody were saying, well, like say somebody had jaundice and they saw a mountain as yellow, right, because they had an eye problem. Like, of course people can analyze with each other, saying, oh, I see that mountain is yellow, and then somebody else says, oh, no, it's white. Oh, maybe you have this disease, and let's check. 5 other people looked. Does everybody else see it as, how do you see it? Oh, we all see it as white. Like, that's still a conventional level of analysis. And Chandrakirti says, like, he says, like, I leave that to you. What he means by that, I think, is like, that's still not relevant to emptiness. That's just a kind of conventional, to figure out if the person has jaundice or not, let's say. But what he's getting at is, when it comes to the ultimate status of, is that a mountain from its own side? Then that's a question for a Majjhimaka philosopher. So it's not that you can't engage in some level of discussion about conventionalities, like, but you don't engage in ultimate analysis. That's the phrase that they sometimes use.
Yeah. So there's like no benefit actually. Like if you're trying to understand emptiness, is there any benefit to know how the conventional phenomena exist then? Like
to know how they exist?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is actually, in the sense that like there's another famous line where it says something like I'm not getting the exact phrasing, but basically it says, it's only in reliance upon conventional things that we can realize the ultimate. You know, and so for example, like the self, let's say, right? Like in other words, you have to look at like how should I say it right? Since the nature of the self is dependently arisen. Right? If you can understand how the nature of the self is dependently arisen, that will help you understand its emptiness. But does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Right. But I guess so you don't do analysis of it. You understand how it exists, but not, you don't analyze conventional phenomena per se. Is that what, you understand how it exists in relation to ultimate phenomena, but not, you don't go into analysis of conventional phenomena.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to say it the right way. Like, maybe say it a different way just to make sure it's clear. Like, or we're saying the same thing. Like, I think the idea is this: is that in Chandrakirti's system, again, which we'll get more into later, but like, he really differentiates ultimate analysis. Right, is one thing, and ultimate analysis means like you're trying to understand the ultimate nature of a thing. How does it exist? What's its ultimate nature? And that is a meditation that leads to, if it's done correctly, understanding of emptiness. And what he's saying is that's the main concern of Madhyamaka philosophy, actually. But then he's saying when it comes to conventional things, so you say this right. You know, you could talk about their qualities like fire burns, water's wet, I'm walking, all these, like, I mean, there's normal, but he says, like, in that sense, you rely on normal, the way the world is the way he puts it, but the way worldly people or the way normal people talk about it, and you don't try to analyze it ultimately when you're not discussing emptiness. That's what I'm saying.
So my question is, so conventional reality and Atman reality, so they both, so you want to say that conventional reality does not exist in me and them?
Yeah, we'll get to that later, but yeah.
Oh, no, Atman reality,
Yeah.
because I mean.
Yeah, conventional, yeah, eventually we'll get to conventional.
So what's the difference between definitive and interpretive? What's the difference between definitive and interpretive?
Oh, so interpretive, the difference there is this, is, like, so for example, I'll give you an example, like in, they sometimes, so for example, there were times where the Buddha, let's say, was talking to a person and he knew that this person was not ready to hear teaching on emptiness, right? That if they heard that, they would become a nihilist and just think nothing exists. So he just said to them, I'll give an example. So there's a teaching that says, like, so that he would say something like, the self exists, karma exists, you need to be careful of your karma or you'll fall to lower realms, right? That's a correct teaching, actually. Conventionally, that's correct, isn't it? Like, in other words, karma exists. But in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, he says, there's no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no object of it. But in other places, he said there is eye consciousness and form, ear consciousness and sound. And so what he's saying is, for example, the teaching there is an eye consciousness and form, and an ear consciousness and sound are correct, valid, conventional teachings, but they're not the ultimate definitive meaning of the Buddha's teachings. The ultimate definitive meaning is that those things are empty of inherent existence. So it's like, what's the ultimate definitive meaning of the Buddha's teachings? And then there are conventional teachings. And part of what they're getting is those conventional teachings are not necessarily wrong, right? They can be correct on a certain level, but they're not getting at the ultimate intent of what the ultimate truth of the Buddha's teachings, which is emptiness. Mm-hmm. So they sometimes say any teaching that's not teaching the emptiness of inherent existence is interpretable. And the only definitive teaching is the teaching on emptiness. That's one way of describing it. Does that make sense? The difference? Okay. So it's not teaching emptiness explicitly, then it's interpretable.
So these great teachers that wrote these texts, if they disagree with each other, how do you explain that they don't have the same understanding?
There are a few different ways, like, I think I'll give two different examples of that, like, because from traditional sources, like not me making it up, but just like traditional sources, interpretations of that. One is Bhava Viveka, because they give a different interpretation in the case of Bhava Viveka, at least I've heard a different one, than they do in the case of, say, Arya Sangha. With Bhava Viveka, what they say is that, I've read this in a couple of books, like, what they say is that Bhava Viveka was a great philosopher. He was a brilliant person. And that he was a bodhisattva, I guess, but that he had a very slight misunderstanding, actually, himself, in the ultimate meaning of emptiness in that lifetime. And they actually say that, he progressed, quite well in his practice, but he didn't realize emptiness in that life. And that they actually say that when he died, he was reborn, I forget forget which one of the great Mahasiddhas of India. He was born as a tantric practitioner, and then he realized emptiness in his next lifetime. So he had gotten quite close to the correct understanding, but the slight, that's why they say most of his explanation was correct, but the Chandrakirti corrected these very slight misunderstandings. So some of the teachings say that, for example, that Bhava Viveka, these very slight sort of incorrect, or what does he say it? Seemingly slightly incorrect, or something. These slightly incorrect points were because he hadn't actually realized it himself yet, and they say that it was in his next lifetime that he achieved enlightenment. So that's one way that they sometimes interpret it. Then in the case of Arya Asanga, they actually say that Arya Asanga had seen emptiness directly and was a bodhisattva. I forget what bhumi, he was on one of the bhumis. He was a great, somebody who had realized emptiness long before, or quite some time before he wrote his text. But in his case, what they say is that his actual view of emptiness was the same as Nagarjuna's, but that he saw a need. Or is that Nagarjuna had written his texts, that he saw that some people were in danger of becoming nihilistic and sort of thinking nothing exists and therefore I can do whatever I want, and that he recognized that there was a need that actually the Buddha had taught some mind-only scriptures, and that Nagarjuna, Asanga recognized there was a need to sort of emphasize those teachings and write treatises or texts on them, because if he did, people would not become nihilists, would continue to practice, and that the view of the mind-only school helps humongously to decrease one's mental afflictions, brings one closer and closer to the view that Chandrakirti was saying, and that by people practicing the mind-only approach, they would progress quite far, and then eventually they would naturally realize they would have enough merit, they would have enough practice, and they would sort of be very close to that, and then through one verse or one phrase or a little bit more study, they would realize the ultimate view. And so out of compassion and sort of a need for certain kinds of students that he wrote those treatises. So those are two different interpretations. Like, if you look in the actual text, like histories of the way other Buddhist masters interpret that point you're asking, those are two different ways they interpret it. And even with the Buddha, now the Buddha obviously understood everything correctly. It's the nature of what a Buddha is, they say. But and the Buddha taught, the Prajnaparamita sutras, which teach what Nagarjuna explained. But he also taught certain mind-only scriptures, actually. And they say he did that for the same reason, that he recognized some students, if he only taught in accordance with the Prajnaparamita, the sort of negation of inherent existence, that they would become afraid, they say, afraid or nihilistic or sort of abandon the Dharma. And so, they use these metaphors. So like a raft that would carry the person across the river, he taught something provisional to help the person's practice, that they would eventually then, like you get to the other shore and you leave the raft behind, that kind of thing. Like that the person would rely on that for a time and then would be able to move beyond it. So does that make sense? So I've seen both of those interpretations depending on who it is. Like in Asanga's case, nobody says he didn't understand emptiness. They all say, no, he just explained it that way because it would help others. Whereas in Bhava Viveka's case, some people say, that he realized it in his next lifetime. Okay, and so then, so then he's just saying that he's going to, so Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying, he's going to, I'll use this phrase, he says, he's going to, following in the footsteps of the masters Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti. So he's just saying he's going to rely on their interpretations as definitive. Now he gets into an important section, which is the identification of afflicted ignorance. And the first thing he gets at is he says, actually, so he's getting at a point here, first of all, wisdom or special insight has to be an antidote to ignorance. Does that make sense? So like wisdom is going to overcome ignorance. Then he gets into a point here, he says, but we have to understand the right kind of, so we have to understand ignorance if we're going to try to develop wisdom, which is an interesting point, isn't it? If you can't identify your own ignorance, you're not going to develop, actually there's sometimes a metaphor like this. He says, if you don't understand they call it the object of negation. In other words, your own ignorance and your own experience. Then your wisdom, then trying to analyze through these reasonings and so on, will be like an archer, or it could be an archer, let's say, whatever, somebody with a gun, doesn't matter, same thing. Who doesn't know where the target is? Like, so you're a blind person just sort of shooting an arrow, but you're not going to hit the right target. So now he says, the antidotes to other mental afflictions such as attachment taught by the victor, meaning the Buddha, are partial antidotes. Whereas the antidote to ignorance he taught becomes an antidote to all of them. Therefore, ignorance is the basis of all errors and faults. So first of all, what he's saying here is, in the Buddhist teachings, right, there are antidotes. We've studied some of those to different mental afflictions, right? Like if you have hatred, an antidote is love. Right? If you have if you're exaggerating sometimes with certain kinds of obsessive attachment to something, you exaggerate the qualities of that thing, right? So then thinking about the faults of that thing decreases that. And what he's saying is those kind of antidotes are useful, but they're provisional, they're partial. All they do is sort of temporarily decrease a certain mental affliction, but they don't uproot it from the root, and so on. And then he says, ignorance is the basis of all errors and faults. So what he's getting at there is, it's our ignorance, self-grasping ignorance. Here he's talking about self-grasping ignorance, right? That it's through our self-grasping ignorance that all the other mental afflictions come to arise. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's self-grasping, grasping at a self, and grasping at phenomena. So grasping at a truly existent self, then we give rise to attachment or grasping, hatred, pride, doubt, jealousy, and so on. All those things arise due to self-grasping. So ignorance is primary. Shantideva uses a metaphor to explain this point. He says, at some point, all the other mental afflictions are like foot soldiers. Ignorance is like the king of the enemy. It is if you, and it's like that in a war. If you kill like a foot soldier, you don't win the war, right? Yeah.
Hey, Lord, I just is something that I just got a question in my mind. So when we say, or when we hear, when the teachers say, self-grasping, right? So every time, I read about it, I've heard a teaching or something on self-grasping. Does self-grasping from that, from that expression, that includes, like you just said it, that includes self and phenomena. It's the whole thing. It's like self-grasping there means this inherent existence.
Yeah, actually, he says here, on the next page, actually, he addresses exactly what you're saying. It is the superimposition of a self, more specifically two superimpositions, of self of phenomena and of persons. So self-grasping is the superimposition or the projection of an inherently existent self of a person and also of phenomena.
Oh.
Yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa says very directly, right, on the next page. So good question. You're on the same wavelength. So then Lama Tsongkhapa, quotes Chandrakirti, a clear word, the Chandrakirti's text, clear words. And what he's saying here is, it's actually interesting. He's saying, also, he makes a point, Chandrakirti. He says, if you apply the antidote to hatred, it won't get rid of attachment. So if you start to meditate on love, and actually there's a funny, beautiful text by Chandra Goman, called Difficult Beginnings. It's very sweet. And in it he says, he says this, he says, he's describing how at the beginning of his spiritual practice, he says, I felt so much anger that I started meditating on love. But then when I meditated on love, I started getting attached to people. So then I started thinking about their unattractive qualities. But then I stopped having any compassion for them, which wasn't good. And then he says, and then I did, and he kind of talks about how every time he applied an antidote to one mental affliction, it would work, and then some other mental affliction would arise, and he says, this is really hard, It's quite a beautiful, nice text. Chandrakirti is kind of making the same point here, in a way. He's saying, each time you apply an antidote, it's good, we have to do that as beginners, right? That's why Chandra Gomez says difficult beginnings, right? As beginners, we have to apply the antidotes to the things, right? But the same thing, so you have pride, right? Like arrogance. And then if you start thinking about your own faults, you can eventually become very discouraged and think, oh, I'm so bad. and then you feel discouraged, which is another problem. So there's this challenge there, but he said, but they do work in the sense that they decrease the mental affliction. But then he says, he said, for example, what was taught to exhaust for the sake of exhausting pride will not overcome other defilements and so on, right? Then he says, all the mental afflictions are thoroughly based on ignorance. That's what the victors taught. So what he's getting at is, as beginners, we do have to apply those other antidotes to mental afflictions, but ultimately we need to eradicate ignorance, which is the root of all the mental afflictions, and then all the others will wither away as well. So he says, that being so, you must meditate on suchness, the antidote to ignorance. Moreover, unless you have identified ignorance, you will not know what to cultivate, how to cultivate its antidote. Therefore, it is extremely important to identify ignorance. And this is hugely important, because we have to identify ignorance, and part of this is like, he's going to use words here, but of course there's no other way to do it. But we have to understand it intellectually. Remember how he said there's the wisdom of listening and then the wisdom of contemplation? Ultimately, in the wisdom of contemplation part, what we need to do is to, when he says you have to understand, how do you say it? Identify ignorance, right? First you have to identify it intellectually, but then you have to identify it in your own experience. Does that make sense? And so if you can't identify your own ignorance in your own experience, then you can't refute it. And then you'll refute something else, which is fine, but won't get rid of your ignorance, right? So each of us has to be able to identify our own ignorance in our own experience. So then he says, and he actually has a point here, not just any ignorance is the root of samsara. So he says there are a lot of different kinds of ignorance, like we're ignorant of a lot of things. And not just any wisdom liberates us from samsara. It's only a certain wisdom, right? The wisdom of emptiness. So here he's saying, ignorance is the opposite of knowledge, but knowledge, on the other hand, should not be taken as just any knowledge, right? Rather, it is the wisdom knowing the suchness of selflessness. Its opposite is not suitable to be the mere absence of that wisdom or just something else. Therefore, it is an antagonist. So what he's getting at here, too, and the Dalai Lama often points this out. So first, you get this point, right? If you want to eliminate samsara, you have to identify ignorance in your own experience. But not just any ignorance, right? You have to identify the subtle, they sometimes call it the subtle innate ignorance, right? Kind of an innate ignorance that's been with you since beginning this time. It's a kind of subtle ignorance that all of us have and that insects have. It's not an intellectually acquired ignorance, this ignorance. It's an ignorance that's instinctual, that came with us from life to life since beginningless time. And then he's making a point, he's saying, so we have to actually identify that particular ignorance, right? Because there are lots of things, I may be, like, I'm ignorant of the capital of certain states or something. That's not going to, eliminating that ignorance is not going to eliminate samsara, right? I may be ignorant, I'm ignorant of, there are countless topics that we're all ignorant, we're ignorant of. But that, eliminating those won't eliminate samsara, right? And then, but it's this specific ignorance of grasping at an inherent existent self that's the cause of samsara. And then he's making a point about where he says here, antagonist. What he's getting at there is this, is the wisdom understanding emptiness has to be a direct refutation of that ignorance. Absolutely direct opposite of it, or it's not going to eliminate it. Does that make sense? So like, if you have a grasping at a certain, it's like, say it right. Yeah, anyway, that's it. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't get too far off track. So the wisdom that we're trying to cultivate, first you have to identify what exactly this self-grasping ignorance is, and then the wisdom has to be an exact antidote to that, or an exact opposite of that. Yeah, it has to be the exact opposite. So in other words, if you're saying like this exists, it has to say this doesn't exist, this exact thing, right? Like, it's like if I say A exists, the wisdom has to be A doesn't exist. It can't be B and C don't exist, right? That's not going to refute that. So it's got to be, you have to experientially understand what that ignorance is, and then the wisdom has to be a direct refutation of it. Now he gets into the detail that was related to what Gabe was asking. So what is this ignorance, right? the self, explaining the two subtle apprehensions of a self as mental afflictions. So he's saying here, it is the superimposition, right? So what does superimposition mean, right? Like you're projecting something, you're adding something. Your own mind is adding something on. Does that make sense? You're superimposing something. You're adding or projecting something. So it's the superimposition of a self, and more specifically, two superimpositions of a self of phenomena and of persons. So both apprehensions of a self of phenomena, of a self, phenomena, and an apprehension of a self of persons are ignorance, right? So there, and there's a point in this Prasangika school's perspective. They're equally subtle. So the difference between those is not subtlety. It's just what the object is, right? Whereas if it's, and self here means yourself. It doesn't mean somebody else's self, right? So there's the fundamental one. First of all, is how you superimpose, right? As it says there, superimpose a self here onto you, right? And then phenomena, right? Means, well, mostly, I mean, you'll get into this in a second. Phenomena could mean the parts of your body, your own mental afflictions, your own thoughts and feelings, or it could also be external things. Does that make sense? So phenomena means anything that's not, and so here self means you, or for me it means me, right? And then phenomena means the stuff that makes up one's own body and mind, or one's own possessions and so on. So superimposing a self onto those things. Now he says, the manner of superimposition is to apprehend that phenomena exist. Now this is really important, right? So, because he's saying, what does that mean, a superimposition of a self? What kind of a self? Does that make sense? Because if you were trying to identify our ignorance here, so he's trying to teach us how to identify it, right? So he's saying, you superimpose or you project or you add a self onto yourself and onto stuff. Now he's saying, well, what kind of superposition? It's like, what exactly is this? So he's saying, is to apprehend that phenomena exist by way of their own entity, by way of their own character, or inherently. In this regard, as it says, he quotes the questions of Upali Sutra. The sutra says, the various flowers that gladden the mind, the golden, resplendent, attractive mansions, both completely lack a creator. They are posited by the power of conception. The world is imputed by the force of conception. Then he quotes Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas. Since the perfect Buddha said that the world has ignorance as its cause, why would it be invalid to say that the world is due to conception? Or another way of saying that is to the conceptual mind, right? I'll read one more of these quotes, right? This is from, it's the 400, it says in the 400 stanzas, if in the absence of conception, desire and so forth do not exist, who with intelligence would uphold intrinsic realities and conception? So anyway, what he's getting at here is this, right, what does that mean? I'm just going to go back, right? He said, by way of their own entity, by way of their own character, or inherently. So actually, this is actually, I'll just say, like, to understand emptiness, I think what he's getting at here is probably the most important part. If we don't get this correct, he said it, right? If we don't get this correctly, all the rest will just be kind of an intellectual game or something, to some extent. If we don't understand, because emptiness means, right, the word emptiness, right, shunyata in Sanskrit, right, means it's empty of something, right? In other words, emptiness is not like some blankness, it means it's empty of something. This is what it's going to be empty of, right? So if we don't understand this, then the word emptiness just becomes a meaningless word, right? Like, you get the idea. So it's empty of its, so it's empty of a superimposition, right, or projection, that it exists by way of its own entity, or by way of its own character, or inherently. Sometimes in other translations they'll say exists by its own nature, or from its own side. Right? So what does that mean, actually? Maybe I'll pause and ask you, so what is he saying? Like, that's English, right? By way of its own entity.
That's what he was saying.
What?
By mere name, then.
So you're saying it, so explain what you mean, I'm not sure.
Okay, so you're saying, like, so they don't they don't exist by their by their own entity, by their own character, or inherently, right? So then, like, they so I thought about what he said, like, so they exist in mere name. Like,
Yeah, so what is what you're one way of saying is, so this would mean it exists some way more than, to say it exists with superimposition would mean saying it exists more than from its own, than in mere name. Right? That it has something more than existing in mere name. Yeah, that'd be one way of saying that too. Yeah, that's right. And I just want to, just like, because again, because I think it's so important. I'm just trying to figure this out. Like, if I hold this up and say, what is that? Right? Like you say, a book, right? And it seems like you could point, right? There's a book there, right? Anybody would feel like, oh, you look right there. It's there, right? Like, so it exists by way of its own entity, there. By way of its own character. It's a book from its own side, right? It's a book right there. It's a book that exists inherently over here as a book.
Only if you have a concept of a book.
That's part of what he's saying, right? Yeah, but we don't think that usually, right? Like in other words, in other words, if we're not analyzing it like that, right? Then like when you go out to your car, right? Like, and actually for sure we would feel it, right? Like if you went out to your car and somebody had spray painted something on it, right? There'd be a feeling like my car, right? Like that it exists there, and we wouldn't think it exists in mere name or a mere concept, right? Especially if somebody spray painted like an insult on it or something, right? So I'm just giving you a simplistic example, right? That the feeling here that we're getting at is that it exists somehow more than by a mere concept, or more than by a mere name, right? That's all I'm saying. Like, you guys are correct in what you're saying. Right? So, because that's what he's getting into this whole thing about, through the power of the conceptual mind, right? Or through the power of labeling. So he's saying things actually exist through the power of conceptions, but we superimpose, and it's more than just like an intellectual superimposition, though, isn't it? Right? Like, if somebody tries to murder you, right? Like, the feeling isn't I'm superimposing a me, right? The feeling is, what's the word? Like this incredibly like where you might kill somebody, right? Like you might kill the person if you could, to protect yourself, right? So it's that instinctual, right? It's this very deep, instinctual superimposition that things exist, that I exist, that my car exists, that the book exists, more than in mere name, or more than through the power of, how do you say, conception, right? A concept. Like, so in other words, yes, right, it would say, oh, it's a concept of a book, or it's a concept of a car, it's a concept of a person. But we're superimposing that it really exists that way, is what he's saying. Does that make sense?
So is this the conventional truth? If you superimpose, like, say like, oh, that's amazing, that's fantastic, like.
There's always a story. Instead of just accepting for what is appearing, you have to put a story about everything. So we've lost the initial appearance. We're sitting in the story. Or whatever what we consider is real, inherent. We built that up instead of just accepting as we're going.
First of all, I agree with what both of you said, and also, though, there's something to contemplate. I just want to put it forward to think about. Is, because you said, Fidel, you said what was the word you used? Like, it's great?
Yeah, so if
amazing,
like
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you can say there's an object. You may see an object like a watch, right? It's a watch. When you say that watch is so beautiful,
which is similar to a story. It's the beginning of a story, like you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the subtle. It's just something to contemplate. Because I agree with what you guys are saying. That's all superimposition, right? The word amazing is superimposition, or terrible is superimposition. But part of what he's getting, and those are all concepts. Right, conceptual mind, like he's saying. So that's correct. But if you're trying to get at what this existing by way of its own entity or by way of its own character inherently, it's like almost like, this is my own thinking at least, is that to say it the right way. It's what he's getting at here is the very first superimposition that all those other superimpositions depend upon. So, in other words, and it's true, right? Because we do make up stories, we make up all kinds of labels. And part of the thing, though, is that this is what's tricky, right? If you just refute, say, let's say you say this thing. Let's say I say, oh, this thing exists by way of its own entity, and I say, oh, and it's great, it's very useful, it helps me with various things, right? If I only refute it's helpful and it helps me with various things, if that were all I refuted, then it would be back to what Chandrakirti was getting at before, where I would only be refuting the basis of desire.
That's just discrimination, right?
Discrimination in what sense?
In the classical sense.
Oh, yeah.
Of the five.
Yeah, that's
So-
correct.
Right, so you're going beyond that to the initial discrimination.
Yeah, and so what we're needing to refute here is the fundamental basis for all of our other conceptual, right? It's the very first concept in a way in relation to a thing, which is that it even exists by way of its own character at all. Then we add on what is its character? Oh, this is great, this is bad. But those are secondary in a way. And what we're trying to get at here in this ignorance is that most fundamental level of ignorance. So it's more fundamental than amazing.
So we try to refute independent.
Independent, yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah, independent, yeah, inherent, or existing from its own side, existing existing as something that it actually exists from its own side, is one way of saying it. Right? Or existing as something that actually exists. Interesting this phrase, right? It's by way of its own entity, right? Like entity, right? Like because what does it feel like for something to be an entity, right? It means like it exists, I guess, independently, right? Or exists like an entity is something that feels like it exists independently, or exists from its own side, or exists there, right? Not through a concept, right? Like, because yeah, you get the idea, right? Like,
So it's kind of related to what we're talking about, but so when you say like when this says by way of their own character, is that when you grab the book and you say, okay, so this is a book, but I immediately say like a superimpose, like, well, that's a Dharma book. So the sense of importance of that book is like, oh, that has more. So I'm superimposing that. But is that character? Is that the character? Like when they're talking about its own character, is that?
no, here. I mean, I get what you're saying, and that again, it's like that is a superimposition, right? But here he's getting at something more fundamental, which is like, even before you think Dharma book, there's like, it's a book, or it's a thing even, that exists there. That it's that fundamental. You know, it's like, yeah.
So then that would be like the story. Like when I start going into like it's a Dharma book and it has value and it's.
Those are more superpositions. But the most fundamental, you know, and it's like, I'm trying to even give like an example, like, you know, if you're like, if you're out walking at night, right? Like let's say you're walking in the, like, if you were walking in the woods at night and you suddenly heard a sound, right? And you didn't know what it was, like if you're in the woods, right? Like, there's immediately, right, this feeling of, and it's subject-object. You don't even know what it is, so you can't say, oh, it's a lion, or that's a mountain lion, or it's one of Asley's dogs escaped and is chasing. I don't know. You can't say what it is yet, right, or something like. But immediately there's this feeling of there's like you know, if you like it was quiet and you're walking quietly in the woods and it's night, you can't see much except just the path in front of you, and suddenly you heard like a loud kind of stepping noise there, right? And there'd be a feeling of there's something there and there's a me that's, it might feel like it's like a powerful feeling of me here. And maybe you haven't yet made up the story. Like then you might make up a story. Well, what if it's a mountain lion, or what if it's a wolf, or what if it's a whatever? What if it's a bad person or something? But this is getting at that very first. It's like what's the phrase he uses? By way of its own entity. There's a feeling of I'm an entity and it's an entity, right? And both of those are actually. I mean, but here the most important would be I'm an entity, right? But also so it's like you're not yet even having to make up a story of it's like this or it's like that, but there's a fundamental feeling of entity-ness or something, or of
The rise of conceptuality.
say it again, a rise of conceptuality. Yeah. There's a kind of it's like a very fundamental. It's almost a it's interesting too because like this kind of we say label, merely labeled, right? But this kind of labeling is not, you don't even have to have words yet. There's a fundamental sense of me-ness or something, or it-ness or something. And we don't even have to, like, it's not like you have to say, oh, I'm Lorne and I'm here. It's like, it's this very fundamental sense of I.
But that initial feeling doesn't feel wrong, but it feels like the addition of the stuff, the conceptuality about that, other than because that it rises is there a lot, especially when you think about it. But conventionally, it's true. Conventionally established, trying to keep precision, but then we have to add conceptuality to it, and hence then the story comes.
I guess what I would say is like, part of what we're getting at here is, again, this is why it's great that we're spending time on this, because it's the most fundamental, most important point in some ways. But this, let me go back, this sense of an I, let's say I'm just focusing on the self now. So the self that exists by way of its own entity, or by way of its own character. I mean, again, I gave like a slight, I gave an example of a sound or something, on a night or something. But the reality is actually that, according to according to the teachings, let's just say right, some level of the appearance of a self that exists by way of its own entity is there all the time for us. So we're never without that. We've never yet had the experience of being without that. And then, like, there are times where we grasp with that more strongly. That's why I was giving the example of at night, a sound or something, where it's a kind of a stronger grasp. Or if you walk out and somebody has vandalized your car, it's a stronger grasping. But we only sometimes we only sort of, it's a point to understand this. We sometimes think of more extreme examples in order to sort of see it more clearly. But the idea is that we're always, there's a word like assenting to or believing in that false appearance. Or so things always appear to us as if they existed in their own. Like right now, until I say it, you weren't thinking this room exists by way of its own entity. Right? That wasn't a conscious thought because you weren't paying attention to the room necessarily because we're talking about a topic. But it's there as a background, like, it's like as soon as you see, as soon as you think of the room, as soon as you're in the room, somewhere subconsciously, it's always there, right? Like, and it never occurs, and you never think, I'm merely labeling room, right? That's never how it appears to you, to me, to any of us. So, are you had something?
I forget where I was going.
Oh.
Something around just, I don't know that I had a question, just how I'm trying to grasp it. Just very fundamentally, anytime you say there's this and that, you can make, there's, whether that's me and that lamp or left hand, right hand, or any kind of discrimination. Like that's what we're getting at, is that very fundamental thought that it gets into the like the opposites. You can neither say that things are same or different, right? They transcend. And that's what's being imposed. That sense of anything being there at all is hard to. I'm just trying to clarify my own thoughts and. But speaking to that fundamental, like it's fundamental beyond perceived object, and then whatever ripples out from that is just that notion that there's even an object there to begin with that's a creation of mind.
Well, and part of what, actually, just to clarify it, I think it's subtle. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's good. That's why I think it's great questions. Like, because part of what, if you think of like the quote from the sutra, right, where he says the flowers exist powered by the, how do you say, posited by the power of conception, posited by the power of the conceptual mind. So part of what this is getting at, and it's subtle, isn't it? Like, because I'm turning back to what you said, is that the I, the you, right, the person, like, does exist conventionally. That's correct, right? We're not saying it doesn't exist conventionally. But what he's saying here is, how does it exist? It exists posited by the power of conception. Right? And so that's not a problem in theory, right? Like there is like, that you can then go to work and go home and take care of your children. I mean, all that, that's all valid, right? And what this is getting at, though, is that that it appears to us, though, and we believe in that appearance, that there's something more than just what's posited by the power of conception. Right? It appears as if it's something more than that, and we believe in that appearance, and that belief is the problem, right? That's self-grasping, actually, right? So the belief that there's something more than what's posited by the power of conception is what self-grasping is, right? So that we sort of superimpose. So it's interesting, right? Because the label, the mere superimposition, like person, or I am going to the store or something, that's not the problem, right? The problem is that we superimpose something more than that, like an I that exists independently, or an I exists by way of its own entity. That's something more than what. So we believe that it's more than what's merely posited by conception. So we sort of superimpose something, or the mind superimposes something more than that. Then we believe in that false superimposition about the nature, that I exists. Because what he says here, by way of its own character or inherently, right? So inherently means that it exists without being merely ascribed or merely imputed by conception. And so we superimpose that, and then we believe that superimposition, and that's the problem. So we really have to differentiate in a subtle way, because in one sense, the person does exist. And it's interesting, right? And this is part of what, it's not getting into here in detail, but it's part of this explanation, is that, like, if you, that's what you say, right? Like, if you're just saying, if we can, in other words, if we never differentiate these two things experientially, right? The sort of merely labeled I, as they talk about it sometimes, and then this additional superimposition, right? Or this appearance, it's actually an appearance of sort of things existing, I existing, by way of its own entity, or by way of its own nature, or inherently, and then this kind of belief in that false appearance. And so part of what they're saying is, if you were actually, one of the implications is if we understood that the I existed merely through conceptuality, that would help us understand that this truly existent or inherently existent or I existing by way of its own entity is false, actually. But we don't ordinarily, ordinary people don't see how the I exists through mere conceptual ascription. And so we, ascribe to or believe in this false appearance of things existing by way of their own entity. So is that, I'm just trying to fine tune something. But does that get at it? I'm not sure what you were.
Yeah. I was trying to think the original thing I was trying to articulate is, first started to talk about that it feels like the function of mind is to, apprehend these a priori objects and, if you have valid, sort of conventional view, through valid thinking, understand the true qualities of these a priori objects. But really what we're looking at here is saying, like, the actual function of mind is to create the appearance of those objects in the first place, like whatever's going on, that's the sort of initial mistake or
Belief, as you said before. You're creating a belief system.
I'm just trying to think of it, because let's go back to what he says, right? So let's just go back and let's make sure we're getting it. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Story, land. He's talking about a story, and he's talking about, basically, so his was much more basic.
Right.
Are you saying, you're trying to get at, or are you trying to get at what is prior to land? The very essence of what you're talking about story, of course, because that's what we're going to do, but are you identifying what we're actually going to be meditating on or working with in order to realize emptiness?
Yes.
Beyond land. I can sort of stop the story briefly, but there's something prior to that is the basis of what we're really working or trying to work with.
Let's use the example of the lamp, okay? Because that's more easy than a person, right? Actually, it's interesting. They sometimes say, in actual practice for meditation, we have to first realize emptiness in relation to ourselves. But for understanding it intellectually, it's easier for something external. So let's use the lamp as the example. Like, so, one point, just to be clear, very clear, and the ones to stop after this, but so one point to be very clear is, what's not being, is like, there are many, actually he said that, there are many levels of ignorance, there are many levels of superimposition. Right? Lama Tsongkhapa said that clearly. We quoted. So, if one were to say I'm going to first say what we're not talking about for a second. Like one can have all kinds of ascriptions or stories or something about the lamp, like, oh, it's a nice lamp, or it's a cheap lamp, or it's an ugly lamp, or I like that lamp, or I don't like lamps, or whatever. And those are all ascriptions, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Those are secondary. We're talking about something much more primary than that. And so going back to what Lama Tsongkhapa said, right? Like, so long, like, part of what part of what we're getting at here is like, some long ago when each of us was a child, somebody taught us the word lamp, right? And so we all have that. We share that label. Somebody else in a different language would have a different label. But part of what we're getting at here is this: is this fundamental? So when you look at that lamp, right? And we label the word lamp, but along with that is a feeling. Or a sense. I'm going to call it a feeling, a sense, an experience. Let's use that word, an experience. That, like, so, like any person, right? Any normal person, even a child, an adult, would say, if I said, where's the lamp? You go, oh, there's the lamp. Right? Where's the lamp that has the light on? They're there. Right? And there's an experience that it exists there. As an entity, or as a thing, right, that exists over there, out there. So I think that's a good word, right? It exists. It really is like our feeling, as our experience is. It exists there, and it exists as a thing, entity, thing, right? What else does he say here? And you feel like your basic experience is it exists as a thing, it exists there, it's an entity, and it has a certain character that's different from something else, like a wall, let's say, right? But so it feels experientially like it exists there. And that experience, right, that it exists there, that it exists as an entity there, that's the ignorance that we're going to refute. Yeah, so you have to identify that experience because it's empty of that, actually. And so it's that fundamental. And so, and then we can do all this kind of reasoning, right? Later we do all this reasoning. Well, there's wires and there's there's plastic and there's metal and there's whatever. That's all for later. But for now, the key is like, and our experience when you say if we're not analyzing, right now we're talking about we're talking about Lama Tsongkhapa's text. But ordinarily, when if you're somewhere, before we started talking about this, if you're just out somewhere and somebody goes, turn on the lamp, right? You turn and you go, you start going towards it, the feeling is it exists there. And it's an entity that exists there. And there's no feeling, I just labeled that. Right? And that there's no feeling it exists, in ordinary life, there's never a feeling in our mind, oh, that exists merely through the power of conceptuality. Right? That never occurs. In other words, that would never be in ordinary daily life as we're going around, and when you're driving home today, right, and a car pulls in front of you, or a car, or whatever, or something, you see a building as you go by, or you see a tree as you go by. We never say, oh, that tree only exists through the power of my mere conceptuality. We never say, oh, that car exists merely through, right? There's a feeling that car exists as its own entity, the tree exists as its own entity, the lamp exists as its own, as a thing that exists there from its own side. And that's quite fundamental, isn't it? We do that in relation to everything. Yeah.
Is everyone experiencing that same, that fundamental, what you're working on explaining?
According to,
that very fundamental, well, we each have different paths, you say. So it sounds like you're saying it's different, but if it's so basic, wouldn't it be the same? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think it's the same, actually. I guess the difference is...
experiences are going to cause a story, but the basic, not what you're working, kind of talks about.
That's ignorance.
Well, that brings
Before
us,
the story, too.
can I add to that question? We each have our own experience, but then even beyond that, we think that there's something under that before our experience, before our story, that's inherently there. Is that close, a little?
I think that's closer. And I go back to your point that I think it is so say it right. Yeah, right. Because people's stories about it would be different. But what you said is correct in the sense that this is more fundamental and one point would be the only. Say it right. Anyone who's not seen emptiness, anyone who's not realized emptiness, let's put it that way, has that same fundamental grasping of the self. Yeah, and it's not different. Yeah, that's not really different for anybody. The secondary stuff is different, right? One person likes the lamp, one person doesn't like the lamp, blah blah blah, all that. But the grasping at the lamp as existing, as you say it, by way of its own character or inherently, or having its own entity, having its own existing there, out there. That's not different for different people. Yeah, it's
so a highly realized person would see, because they've realized emptiness, they can see it on that level too, experience it on that, but they've gone beyond it because they've meditated on it, because they've realized it. And there's another way of, are they viewing things, objects the same, or can they see it differently?
my understanding of that is my understanding of that is that yes, first of all, it is different, and then it depends what level. So a Buddha, like a Buddha's experience is completely different, so I won't get into that today. But they say that a person who's realized emptiness, not a Buddha though, let's say, I mean, so let's leave aside the Buddha for a moment. But a person who's realized emptiness, that for that person, things still appear to their senses as though they existed by way of their own entity. But that person, they use, that's where Khenchen Rinpoche often, not Khenchen Rinpoche just, but Chandrakirti, many people, the Buddha, use the example of illusion. So, like for them, the analogy they sometimes give is it's like the person, you know, in other words, they don't believe that appearance, and so they don't relate to it in the same way. You know, to them it's like a dream, or it's like an illusion, you know, but it's like the person who creates a, you know, like if you go to a magic, they often give this analogy, so I'll just mention it, right? If you go to a show where like a magician's performing tricks, right? You know, if you're the audience person, you're like, you know, it's like, oh wow, what a shock. Or something. But the magician, every step of the way, knows how they're doing the illusion. So for them, they don't relate to it the same way, right? Like, in other words, they don't, you know, like in other words, when they saw the woman in half, let's say, they was on TV, you know, the audience might be going, oh no, is she going to get hurt? You know, the illusion, it would, the magician doesn't have that concept, doesn't have that experience, because they know she's not, you know, it's like that. Or it's like, you know, a hologram of a, you know, like another analogy you could give is like, if somebody created a hologram of a scary monster, right? Like, and you didn't know it was we all didn't know it was a hologram, we might run away and be scared. But the person who put the hologram together and programmed it, and then sort of hit play, that's how, like they would still have, their eye would still see the hologram, but they would have no, they wouldn't have any emotional reaction to it. At least not the kind anybody else would. Does that make sense? Because they would know right from the beginning and the whole time that it's just a hologram. You know, it's just an appearance, in other words. And, you know, they might, so and people label monster and then have some experience, they wouldn't have that same experience. Like, their eye consciousness would still see the hologram because they have eyes, but they wouldn't relate to it the same way. So they give that analogy, that that's what it's like for some, when the person who's seen emptiness or realized emptiness looks at the lamp, that's the analogy, is that they have, it's not that their eye consciousness doesn't see what our eye consciousness sees, but they relate to it in a completely different way, is the idea. And there are many teachings of sutras even, where the Buddha said that, and Chandrakirti said it, and many people have said that point, that so they relate to those appearances in a completely different way.
It's like I hear, you know, inseparability of appearance and emptiness. You know, appearance is, you know, none other than that. You know, there's still appearances, but understood as, you know, your appearance.
Yeah, that's right. We went over, so we should stop. But we'll continue. I mean, again, I'm going slowly through this section because it's a hard section and it's an important one, I think. Thank you. But, Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.